Okay, everyone, welcome to our next slideshow. This one is about the 1970s. This is the where we were supposed to be in the upcoming fourth quarter, starting with the 70s and 80s. So, all right, so let's begin. Can't really talk about 1970s, or at least the beginning of the 1970s, without talking about the election of 1968. We've discussed a lot of that in class. And the election of Republican President Richard Milhous Nixon. If you recall, he was Eisenhower's vice president. He made a name for himself as a Cold Warrior, if you will. He is the one that we didn't prosecute, but he prosecuted the Alger Hiss case, um, uncovered the pumpkin papers, the Whitaker Chambers, I think his name was hiding in the pumpkins and whatnot. So he's also the one that met with Fidel and said that Fidel was communist and that went in that direction. So, but he didn't win the election of 1960. Um, a younger man won it, John F. Kennedy, but don't count Richard Nixon out. 8 years later, he comes back, taking advantage of the division and disarray, frankly, within the Democratic Party. What they did at the primary, propping up Hubert Humphrey over the more popular Eugene McCarthy, cost him the election. Um, so here you see, when the day the election came around, Richard Nixon would end up carrying 32 states, 301 electoral votes. His Democratic rival, who was LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, and was basically just shoehorned in there at the convention as a late entry, if you will. He only carried 13 states for 191 electoral votes, and there was a third-party candidate, a deep Southern candidate, George Wallace. I believe this is the second time that he's going to run for office. On a platform. Well, the guy's just a bigot, segregation now, segregation forever. There's a little fun fact here. I believe when George Wallace was running in 72, there was an attempted assassination, which instead the bullet hit him in his spinal column, and he ended up paralyzed for the rest of his life. And he would end up reevaluating his life and his politics because of this accident, and ask for forgiveness afterwards, and etc., etc. So George Wallace, we saw him in 68 and in 72 as a deep Southern uh, candidate, a third-party candidate. He did carry 5 states with him, all deep Southern states, predictably. It's more of a protest vote. So enter the Nixon years. Nixon, for the most part, is occupied with his foreign policy, and so in this PowerPoint, that's what we're going to discuss: Nixon's foreign policy. And the next PowerPoint we do on Nixon, we're going to discuss his domestic policies, and then eventually his his infamous downfall, which I assume most people are familiar with. So Richard Nixon, after one attempt 8 years earlier, bounces back, 37th President of the United States. Richard Nixon also represents something: the conservative backlash to what was perceived as liberal excess from the left particularly throughout the late 60s. Middle America, older voters, frankly, just did not really care for. And it's hard to see things this way because that's you know the news covers the crowd, sometimes of hundreds of thousands, protesting the war, the hippies in San Francisco, the Black Panthers in Oakland, and we're like, oh my God, this is the way the country is, this direction the country is turning into. But they were never the majority. Mainstream, Main Street United States, just never bought into that. And they retained a significant conservative political streak from their Eisenhower years, frankly. Um, and this, Nixon election, many people look at it as this is the beginning of a conservative wave, a conservative backlash against what they saw was, the left having gone too far during the 1960s. And this is going to play itself out into the Reagan years. Some may even say, perhaps even, the final vestiges of this wave, if you will, into the Trump years. And Richard Nixon very much positions himself as in opposition to Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, which in itself was an extension of FDR's New Deal. And Richard Nixon's, Eisenhower was a moderate Republican. He wasn't going to rock the boat. But Richard Nixon is the first of those post-war Republicans that's really going to try to go after and dismantle uh, the New Deal status quo that had entrenched itself in American politics since FDR. And he's going to enjoy, he's going to ride a wave of popularity, particularly in middle America, small town America, rural America, older white America that didn't really care for the direction the country had gone in the 1960s. So a lot of this is relevant to domestic history. Let's talk about Nixon on the foreign policy front. And what does the world look like in 1972, a couple of years into Nixon's presidency? This is where we get these terms first world, second world, and third world. The first world is everything there you see in blue. Basically, the Western style, either presidential or parliamentarian liberal democracies. Um, United States, Great Britain, Australia, Western Europe, etc., etc. Then you have the second world. The second world, um, it was not a statement of poverty and whatnot. The second world was, that's the Soviet Union, that's China, um, and even a couple of others there. You have Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, China, but you also have Cuba. One country there in Africa that's north of Angola, that might be the Democratic Republic of Congo. Um, and that's about it at this time. But we have some other colors there too. And this is, you have to understand the context. Everything you see there in olive green, those are military dictatorships. If we look at Latin America, the vast majority of Latin America was under some sort of military dictatorship. Why? Almost always under the pretext of, we had to do this in order to prevent Cuban influence from spreading into the region. Chile was a democracy. Venezuela was a democracy at the time. Colombia, a limited democracy. Mexico, a limited democracy, a one-party state. Every country you see there in yellow, these are one-party states. So whether they were democratic or not, that's up for discussion. Everything you see in purple, these were monarchies, some of the last monarchies left in the world. But and everything you see in white, which is not really much, these are the last remaining colonies. After what, 30 years, 25, 30 years after the end of World War II, these are the last remaining colonies. Although I think our Africa map there should be more complex because there was a number of independent struggles ongoing in Africa at that time. And this is the world that is put on Nixon's desk when he's president. A very unpopular war in Vietnam. Okay. A Soviet Union that is no longer interested in exporting revolution anymore, but rather encouraging pro-Moscow governments to somehow um, win through elections. The Chinese and the Russians are not talking to each other even till then, even at that moment. And then you have, if anybody's an aggressive player in the second world, it's Cuba that is actively attempting to export revolution throughout Latin America and Africa. And by the way, everything there's not red or blue, that's what's considered the third world. It was never a statement. We've turned it into that later on. It was never a statement about development or poverty or whatnot. It was always a statement: you're either the first world, you're the second world, or you're in the third world, which means you are not in the Western camp and you're not in the Eastern camp. You're somewhere in the middle. If Nixon leaves his stamp on our foreign policy in any way, shape, or form, is that well, you have to understand Nixon's very close relationship with his foreign policy guru, if you will, Mr. Henry Kissinger, who kind of advertised himself as, being a more rational, real politics sort of guy. But when you look at the numbers, the data, the advice that guy he gave led to a lot of, unnecessary death in the opinion of a lot of people. And Nixon's doing this not in a vacuum. And we're going to talk about this later. The United States is heading into some serious financial straits. The economy is not growing like it used to before. The expense of the Vietnam War and the Great Society is weighing down on economic growth, is creating historical budget deficits for the United States government. Our trade deficit is getting higher than ever. We're more and more dependent on imported oil than we were before. So you could say this was a choice. Can we continue to pursue an aggressive foreign policy against the Soviet Union, against Brezhnev's Soviet Union? Or can we somehow work out some sort of a peaceful coexistence? Remember how this starts. This starts with Truman's containment, okay? Eisenhower and JFK's, brinksmanship, eventually leading us to, promises of massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction, okay? So all those years, um, the hostility, the antagonism between the two camps becomes increasingly heated, increasingly heated. By the time we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's an attempt to step back from this, a more of a measured response. But Vietnam War just dragged on and on and on. So by the time Nixon is there, he and there's a political will in Washington to try a new approach, détente. That means maybe we don't agree with each other, um, but maybe we should have to accept the fact that we exist. The Soviets and the United States, in their own right, are powerful and influential, and maybe we should try to forge some sort of a peaceful coexistence. I mean, this goes back to Khrushchev. Khrushchev tried, but in that particular political atmosphere, the U.S. didn't have the political will to do so. Now, because of the economic situation, there's the political will. So, right, we're reading here. What did détente basically mean? It meant a foreign policy position adopted by the Nixon administration on the advice of Henry Kissinger, which promoted a relaxation, a thawing of the strange relationships between the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. The earliest instance that we see of this thawing is when it comes to China. You have to understand, from 1945, the Chinese were our allies throughout World War II, meaning the Chinese nationalist government, Chiang Kai-shek. When the Japanese are driven out and the two largest camps in China, the communist and the nationalist, no longer have the Japanese to fight. They start fighting against each other, which is they were antagonistic towards each other even before the Japanese invaded in the 1930s. And some may say our lack of support to the Chinese nationalists. It's complicated. Long story short, the communists walk out the victors in 1949, having won the Chinese Civil War. And the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek being, the leader of the nationalists, they flee to Taiwan, which is an island off the coast of mainland China. There was already an indigenous population there, so they were kind of pushed to the side, and they established the Republic of China. So you understand, the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, two very different things. Republic of China is non-communist, pro-West, and we could talk about the White Terror that was unleashed there under Chiang Kai-shek. And then the People's Republic of China, which had its own Red Terror by orders of magnitude worse. It was founded in 1949. Well, understand, up until 1945, from 1945 until 1971, the only country that we were willing to accept as the official representative of the Chinese people was the Republic of China. The People's Republic of China did not have a seat or a voice in the United Nations. One way to ease the Republic of China into the community of nations and perhaps twist and turn some reforms, take advantage of not the best relationship between the Soviet Union and China, is to offer an olive branch to the Chinese. I mean, one of the reasons why we have such a close relationship with China today, this is the beginning of it. This is the beginning of it. And you know, in our modern politics, when, you know, whenever, you know, our social networks and the news criticizes leaders for how could you meet with this leader and how could you meet with that leader? They're terrible, they're dictators, etc., etc. Richard Nixon sets the trend. Richard Nixon, people forget that. People have amnesia, but Richard Nixon did something incredibly controversial at that time. And you know, let's give credit where credit was due, and had the foresight to understand, you know, ironically, as the Chinese proverb goes, you get more flies with honey than with vinegar. If he could, by extending an olive branch of sorts, bring the Soviet Union and the China closer to the international community, the world itself would stand more to gain from this. The United States would stand more to gain from this than it to continue the antagonistic posturing that had existed since 45. So the United States drops its opposition. Two things come out of this. The People's Republic of China now gets a seat in the United Nations, veto power in the United Nations, and basically replaces the Republic of China as the official representative of China in the United Nations. Other things come out of this. Did we leave Taiwan out in the cold? It would seem that we did. But at the same time, we signed a treaty with Taiwan. Okay? This sucks. Understand, this is politics. At the same time, we signed a treaty with Taiwan. If they should, a mutual defense pact, if they should ever be threatened by the People's Republic of China, the United States, by international law, by treaty, is bound to come to the defense of Taiwan. We can't out in the open recognize Taiwan as the official government of the Chinese people. This upsets the People's Republic of China very much so, which believes that Taiwan is not sovereign. It is a renegade republic. We sell armaments to Taiwan. We have a defense pact with Taiwan. And that is what we gave them in exchange for them stepping down and giving the UN seat to the People's Republic of China. And this is followed through the following year with Richard Nixon making first ever post-war, I think first ever, you know, official visit by a sitting president to the People's Republic of China. This is a monumentous occasion. I mean, so, oh my God, how could you meet with him? Remember, you know, he's shaking their hands there with Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is credited with millions, you know, of people murdered during not only his regime, during the Chinese Civil War and the foundation of the Chinese People's Republic, the People's Republic of China, but during the Cultural Revolution, which was less than 5, 6 years old in China. And yet, you know, here you have Nixon shaking hands with this guy. This was all to bring China into the end, and maybe China could get the Vietnamese. Remember, the Vietnam War is still going on. Well, it just ended, actually. This is kind of like a gift for China's role in pushing the Vietnamese to negotiate, you know, also for an end of the war, the North Vietnamese. From this, things are going to come, okay? Soon after Mao steps down, Deng Xiaoping is going to come you know, become the new president of China. China's going, because of this visit, China opens up to flirting with capitalism, establishing market reforms, and you're going to see China from this moment, 20, 25, 30 years from this moment, do an incredible job in lifting people out of poverty because of these market reforms. And not only that, we establish China as a favored nation status when it comes to trade with the United States. The reason why so many things are sold here in the United States that are made in China, the root goes back to these diplomatic efforts by Nixon, okay, to establish good relations with China to this day. The diplomacy, the olive branch did not stop with China. A couple of months later, Richard Nixon, it's not the first time, he visited the Soviet Union when he was vice president, Eisenhower's vice president. But here he is again, visiting Russia in May of 1972. Again, in another attempt to ease the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, with Premier Brezhnev, a more conservative Soviet leader, to reach an accord. Listen, whatever's under Moscow's sphere of influence is under Moscow's sphere of influence, and whatever's under the American sphere of influence is under the American sphere of influence. And that's just the way it's going to be. If any accords were signed between the Russians and the Soviets and the United States, it had to do in the area of nuclear weapons, because that was the one sword that was hanging over, the head of humanity at that time, the growing number of nuclear weapons. So, what came out of this meeting when Nixon went to speak with Brezhnev was the first SALT talks. They called them the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Out of this, the Soviet Union and the U.S. signed the SALT I Treaty, agreeing to limit anti-ballistic missiles and bombers. Okay, so the agreement was to limit anti-ballistic missiles to 200 per country, intercontinental ballistic missiles, a little over 1,000 for the U.S. and 1,500 for the Soviet Union. Warheads to about 5,700 each, and nuclear subs to about 41 to 42 each. This is going to be followed through with other weapons limitations. And here's a picture of the B52 Graveyard. Yeah, that's what we did. We spent billions of dollars on this stuff, and then we just, when it becomes old or expired or no longer politically useful, just let it rot in the desert. So what about Nixon in Vietnam? We talked about this in class. Nixon took a different approach. He understood that public opinion was turning against the continued war in Vietnam. He didn't immediately end it, though. He wanted to end it with an American victory, as much of an American victory as possible. And he himself committed to very controversial decisions that, if anything, actually antagonized the situation and the anti-war movement. In fact, there's a rumor that the Nixon people, his campaign, actually told the Vietnamese to stall on the Paris peace talks when LBJ's people were still at the table. Okay, so this would hurt LBJ's and the Democrats' positioning in the 1968 election, and actually help Nixon's, to make it seem that the Democrats were incapable of working out a deal with the Vietnamese. Nixon takes over the U.S. Position, the U.S. Position at the Paris peace talks, and these things are going to drag on from August '69, and this is only from the point when Nixon takes over until January of 1973, the bitter end of the war. In that time, and with the purpose of pushing the Vietnamese, of accelerating the process that they would sign a peace with the U.S. What we wanted was for them to just agree to a permanent division of Vietnam. They weren't happy with that. They wanted us to remove the current leadership of South Vietnam, and leave the possibility to a united Vietnam open for the future. You have Nixon's war on Cambodia, which actually expanded the war, killed hundreds of thousands of people. We talked about this, and this raged for about 3 years. This is, during the peace talks. And that decision is going to have dire consequences. It's going to dismantle the government of Cambodia, um, and in that vacuum, uh, communist revolutionaries are going to fill that vacuum of a very extreme iteration, the Khmer Rouge, which is going to contribute to even more death and destruction, on top of the U.S. bombings that took place for over 3 years. And then, in order to push the Vietnamese even further, the United States launched Linebacker 1 and Linebacker 2 up until the eve of the conclusion of the Paris peace talks. And these were a massive bombing campaign, particularly of Hanoi and Haiphong and the North Vietnamese infrastructure. That's interesting. Let's sit down, let's talk about peace, but in the meantime, I'm going to bomb the heck out of your country until you give in to the conditions that I want. This was the foreign policy challenge that was dominant on Nixon's, foreign policy agenda when he walked into office, and it also plays into, détente with the Soviets and reapproachment with the Chinese. If we get the Soviets and the Chinese to back off, to talk to the North Vietnamese, to give in to a peace agreement that's more favorable to the U.S., then we would return that favor with nuclear arms limitations, with trade with the U.S., with political concessions. Now, one thing is détente with the Soviets, reapproachment with the Chinese, working to end the Vietnam War. That's one thing. Another thing is, I guess, what the United States would consider America's backyard, the American sphere, if you will, which the only country that the United States did not control in the region was Cuba, who was actively involved in training, financing, and exporting revolutionaries throughout the region. Now, here's the curious case of Chile. Chile in 1971, I believe. And by the way, Chile was one of South America's oldest democracies at this time. Their constitution was over a century old. In comes Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende is, the first ever declared Marxist socialist that is democratically elected, as an elected democratically by the vote of the people. I mean, you're not going to see something like this again until Venezuela in the 90s. And of course, there's a lot of, discussion about, oh, what about those elections, blah, blah, blah. But, Allende was, we were used to, oh, well, Marxists only take power through violence, through revolutions, but through an election. Did he win a massive majority? No, because Chile had a multi-party system, but he did win a plurality of the votes. And so yes, it's not an exaggeration to say that Chile elected a socialist to be their president. And well, the United States frankly did not care for that. The United States had too much money invested, particularly in mining in Chile. And one thing we know for sure is that the United States became as soon as Allende was elected, very concerned and actively involved in getting rid of Allende. I mean, this is not the first time that the United States, with the assistance of the CIA, goes out to deliberately throw out a democratically elected leader, either because he's a populist or he's a socialist or he's perceived to be a socialist or a Marxist or what have you. If this guy just didn't gel with Washington, it's not the first time that Washington actually orchestrated an overthrow of a democratic elected president. You have Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in the 1950s. You have Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, also in the 1950s. And Salvador Allende is going to be the new victim, unfortunately, for him, of this foreign policy tendency that comes out of the United States. Remember, this is an era that we had a problem with Salvador Allende, but we didn't have a problem with over a dozen dictators. Franco's still there. A dozen dictators that we supported. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. All the military junta governments throughout Argentina and Brazil enjoyed ample U.S. support. Because if we had to prioritize between democracy and free markets came first. Okay? Keep those markets open to American goods and American economic and political influence. And we could care less what kind of person you have in charge, and we could care less of the human rights abuses, and we could care less about the the lack of democracy. But, however, if that person is ideologically on the other end of the spectrum, well, that can't be tolerated, even if he is democratically elected. The kind of cut off my little text box here, but it says, according to declassified National Security Agency memos, Nixon, from the very beginning, orchestrated the overthrow of Allende. And when we talk later on about Operation Condor and U.S. involvement in assisting the military dictatorships of South America, there's more into this. Nixon, according to that memo, made $10 million available, even more if necessary, to make the economy scream, do what you have to do. Almost immediately, the U.S. withheld credit to Chile, told U.S. banks not to touch or lend money to Chile. So Chile was ostracized from the world financial community. Um, so yeah, the CIA also, like they did in Iran before, in Guatemala before, poured a lot of money into into basically creating the opposition, or actually financing and supporting the opposition to Allende, which tended to be, um, you know, middle upper class, the well-off. If it would lead to his resignation or his overthrow, they were particularly fine. They were fine. The CIA funneled millions of dollars into non-state media and into labor unions, paid them to run bad stories, paid them to go on strikes to negatively affect um, Allende's government, and then ultimately was able to enlist military officers that would be willing to go the extra mile and illegally overthrow Allende's government. September 11th, we have 9/11 here in the United States. For Chile, 9/11 goes all the way back to 1973, where Salvador Allende's Minister of Defense, I guess, his top military guy, in an ultimate act of treachery, that's what he does, betrays his president, betrays the Constitution, betrays the vote of the people, acting on behalf of U.S. corporate interests and the interests of the Chilean upper class, basically mobilizes the military to pull a violent overthrow of the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende. Even the presidential palace is bombed by the Air Force. And apparently there's stories that Allende called to his supporters to take out to the streets to not allow this to happen in very Guatemalan-like fashion. Apparently he had an AK-47 with him. There was a gift from Fidel Castro. Apparently Cuban special forces offered to smuggle him out of the situation, out of the country, and he refused to go with them. And the story boils down to whether he was killed in the bombing or whether he shot himself. It's usually the opposition that tries to claim that he shot himself because it makes them, I guess, look better. Um, so what do the Chilean people get? This is the common narrative. Pinochet did what he had to do to save Chile from communism, right? Because that's the narrative. It's going to look like Cuba. What did they get in return? They got, I think, something like 17 years of brutal military dictatorship that led to the extrajudicial murder and disappearance of hundreds of thousands of members of the opposition. not just socialists and Marxists, but student activists, labor activists, some of the worst case abuses of the Pinochet government. Hundreds of thousands of opposition were rounded up into a stadium in Santiago, Chile, and either killed or tortured in that stadium by members of the military. There's a very good documentary on Netflix right now. Probably one of the most famous victims of the Pinochet dictatorship. 'Cause that's what they're going to get. They're not going to get democracy. They're going to get dictatorship, which is usually the way this works. Victor Jara, which was, imagine he was like the Bob Dylan of Chile at the time. So, okay, Mr. American History. Well, this happened with the complete green light and support of the Nixon administration. So it's interesting, a willingness to play nice with the Soviets and the Chinese, and bring a war to an end in Vietnam. But when it came to what was considered the U.S. sphere of influence, um, no willingness to play nice, but actually to be as brutal as possible. So there's other cases, but that's pretty much we're gonna. Well, here's more images of that's the bombing of the presidential palace. That's Allende down there with a army helmet and loyalists that were with him. And so, like for the next 17 years, um, Pinochet is just gonna steamroll that country. It's gonna bring in extreme um, market reforms. Well, extreme market reform. I don't like to be saying that, but he's gonna replace the type of socialism that Allende was experimenting with. Very interesting stuff like that. They were actually working on a computer-based planned economy. You're going to replace it with pretty, predatory capitalism, pretty much led by a guy that came out of the University of Chicago, the University of Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman. And the Chicago boys are going to be invited to Chile to turn Chile into a poster child, a showcase of, look what happens when you introduce, 100% unfettered, laissez-faire capitalism. Um, yes, I'll be lying to you if Chile did not economically flourish, maybe not because of this, but in spite of this, but at an incredible human cost. And the Chileans are still struggling with the infamous history of this. So that's pretty much Nixon's foreign policy. There's other instances, but these are the main ones. And the next time we talk about Richard Nixon, it's going to be his domestic policies.